Panel room, and the topic is interactive fiction. You enter a room. To the right is a door that appears locked. To the left is a staircase leading into darkness. Interactive storytelling has been part of the reading and gaming experience for decades, while immersive theatre, haunted houses, and escape rooms have given writers, performers, and the audience some unique opportunities for innovation and experimentation. So, what draws people to interactive narratives time and time again, and what delights await in the theatre of the mind that cannot be found elsewhere? So, I would like to welcome my panel for today, and I'm going to get them to introduce themselves briefly, one by one, and then I'll say who I am. So, we'll go first to Finn, please.
I am Finn McClellan. I am an SF&F writer, and specifically context of this panel, important thing to note, I am also a LARPer. I will explain more about that one in due course.
Okay, thanks, Finn. And John next.
Howdy, I'm John Kerwin. I studied creativity online for my PhD, specifically interactive media. And I used to work in theater, which weirdly included a stint where I ran groups who were making up stories for reality television. So an interesting version of interactive fiction.
You mean reality TV isn't real?
Shockingly, no. Breaking news.
And not last but not least, Tess.
Hi, I'm Teresa Jean Tannenbaum, or Tess. Up until about a year ago, I was a tenured professor at UC Irvine in the informatics department, where I studied interactive storytelling and performance and interactive performance. But I now live in the woods in central Illinois, where I make music and games and write and art, and generally try to rediscover my creative side.
Cool. Thank you all. And I'm Catherine Sharp. I'm your moderator for this panel. And I suppose my background in interactive narratives, apart from playing a lot of games, is I wrote my own choose your own adventure novel when I was about 13 because I was absolutely obsessed with them. And I was heavily involved in multi-user online game role-playing games, so Muds and Moos and that kind of thing in the 90s and early noughties, and was in charge of writing some sort of big plot lines for those. So when I decided to moderate this panel, I was like, oh, I don't really know much about it. And then I was like, oh, wait, hang on. I used to do these things. So hopefully that gives me enough background to ask some intelligent questions. And if I ask really stupid ones, hopefully the panel, well, I'm pretty sure the panel will give intelligent answers. So I'd like to start out a little bit just discussing, or at least talking a little bit about kinds of interactive narratives. So you've already mentioned some things, we've mentioned some things. So role playing, video games, performance art, where the audience gets involved, LARPs, which for those who don't know what that is, it's live action role playing, and obviously tabletop role playing, all of that kind of good thing as well. Choose your own adventure novels, interactive novels, that sort of thing. And some of them seem to be very scripted. So you have specific paths through them for the audience, for the player, the reader, which could be, you know, a video game. You might have lots of options within that video game, but it's a linear story. And then you might have looser ones where a creator provides a story point, a starting point, and the world building, which would be, you know, would be an RPG. And the story is driven by the audience or the players. Anyone want to add any particular kinds of other types onto that? Because I'm pretty sure I've not covered them. Tess?
I mean, there's also, I think, escape rooms increasingly, and interactive environments and participatory theater. And then theme parks, I think, also have a lot of interesting innovation in terms of immersive storytelling. So, yeah.
Yep, we had escape rooms and haunted houses right in the description of the panel, and I blew right past them.
Yeah, no, you were the one that put me in mind of them. Like, yeah, love this.
Finn, John, anything else you want to add to that long list?
But there's also increasingly more sort of interactive video. It hasn't fully taken off, but it has a tendency to kind of pop up and go back down again. It's a bit like Black Mirror had Bandersnatch, and I think the Gundam franchise has attempted to dip into it recently, which is an interesting one because I think it hits the weird balance between interactive, but not very interactive, which is an interesting area.
Finn, any more?
Think pretty much everything I can think of has already been ticked off, to be honest.
That's okay. I think we've covered quite a lot of stuff. Yes. So I'm
I
gonna.
just thought of another one. I'm sorry.
No, go for it, Tess.
I'm realizing there's also this really interesting growing medium of single-player pervasive games. So journaling games,
Oh, yeah.
single-player LARPs. They're beautiful. There's some really interesting stuff happening, especially in like the queer zine game design community space.
Yeah, I've played some really interesting single player RPGs where you are making the choices, but it just leads to a really different kind of narrative. And I mean, there's video equivalents of that as well. So first off, I want to just ask you a bit more about your background but not as a creator, but as an actual audience member, as a reader, as a player. What's kind of been your favorite thing that you've ever done in terms of interactive narrative, or one of your favorites? I know you can't ask for favorite children at this point. I'm gonna throw that at John first.
Yeah, obviously I've played a lot of role-playing games in the time, both tabletop and video games. But one area that I actually particularly was a fan of was there was a brief period where, as awful as the place is, 4chan's traditional games board used to run interactive choose your own adventure kind of stories, and there's one Ruby Quest, which it only ran for a couple of months, but it was a really fascinating sort of example because as suggestions were coming in, the creator was having to draw up panels and keep the story going. And I found it very interesting because clearly there was a strong idea of what the story was and what the background was, but they didn't put a lot of limits on what could be suggested. So it ended up in this very interesting space where it was definitely a horror setting with a sort of counter-programming aspect where the design of the characters was based off of Animal Crossing. But because of then the humor, it created almost an even better level of tension because you never knew when a jokey suggestion could end up leading to a horrifying image as a result. And I'm very fond of that one because I think it's the first time where I really saw like the unusual type of art that the internet could create, of which I'm heavily invested in at this stage.
It's cool. That sounds like one with a lot of audience contribution to it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because it touches on that very interesting thing of how much of it is made by the audience and how much of it is driven by, the main creator, which is always a fascinating sort of question.
Yeah.
Because we all have that. I imagine it's the same with LARPing and everything else. You have your setting and what you've laid out to happen, but it will never stay exactly on the rails.
That's definitely something we're going to come back to. I'm going to pass to Tess next, though. So what's kind of your background as an audience member?
So I've been, playing tabletop RPGs since I was a kid, and usually it is in the like tabletop analog like experiences that I get the most pleasure when it comes to these things. Like I love video games. I teach people to design video games, but it's the face-to-face stuff that has really been like powerful for me. And I think this is a weird one because I'm kind of both a player, an audience member, and a creator for this, and so it straddles this category a little. But one of my partners and I have been doing for the last 2 years a duet, an RPG duet. We've been doing it mostly remotely because she's in Kentucky and I've been in California and Illinois. And it's called Etude of the Storm. And it's something called a surprise RPG, which another one of our girlfriends sort of created the genre of a few years previously. And what we did is she approached me and said, create a character and tell me a locale, and I'm going to create a historical fiction. And you create that person's life. You give me their backstory, their history, their family, and then I'm going to put them in a situation, and you won't know what that situation is. You're going to be this normal, real person in this situation who hasn't been, like, created as a hero. You're not an adventurer, and you're not a D&D character who knows their character class. You're just a normal person, and then you're going to have to deal with the situation that I create for you. And it is one of the most intimate, profound, emotionally powerful experiences I've ever had as a player, because I made this woman who is a transgender witch in Norway in the 17th century. And I created the culture around her. I gave her a family. I gave her friends. And then Jess has taken her and just thrown her into this adventure, and she's having to, I mean, she's got, some, specific abilities and skills that she has as a healer and as a person and as somebody who has studied, but she's not prepared for what's about to happen to her. And it's me now inhabiting her, trying to face these things that Jess has been throwing at her. And it has been the most effective form of transformative play that I've ever experienced. And it's interesting because my lab was called the Transformative Play Lab. My dissertation was about this thing called transformative play, which was this thing I was deeply invested in. And I didn't experience it fully until I did this. And this happened long after I wrote my dissertation, long after I started my lab. And it's the fullest realization of this thing that I had been looking for when I started studying interactive storytelling.
It's absolutely fascinating, and it sounds, really challenging and really just.
We're also, and we're recording this. That's the other thing. We're recording it, and Jess is going through and editing it and cleaning up the dialogue and adding score and sound design elements and producing it. And so we have this version of it that is this almost actual play story that we've edited. And we have one session left, and then it's over, and then we have it in the bag. And at that point, I think the plan is to go back and script it and cast it and bring in voice actors and do it as a audio drama where we take away the dice rolls, and it just becomes like this mechanism for generating what then is a static story that we create.
I find that actually really interesting, because I've got a friend who's a sci-fi and fantasy author, and I know her from playing the online games back when we were doing all this interactive collaborative stuff, and that's how she writes with her writing partner for ends up New York best-selling Times best-selling novels. They basically sit and they play the different characters out and do it. I mean, it's that interactive creation, and it's kind of beyond interactive narrative and into creation, isn't it? That's okay. So who have I got left? Finn, what's your background? You said LARP a lot.
Yeah, so I actually came up starting in forum roleplay, so the more text-based side of it, and then started LARPing when I was about 20, I think, and have been playing ever since. To be honest, I think the first game I ever played is probably one of my favorite games. So this was a game called Maelstrom, which was run by a company called Profound Decisions, who then later went on to run Empire, which is their current game. And it started off as a sort of exploration, new world type thing. By the time I started playing, it had taken a massive genre shift into survival horror, basically because of player action. So I join, and it's suddenly this, okay, if you walk between two camps on this field at night, you have a very high chance of getting murdered in character if you're going by yourself. There are roaming hordes of undead wandering around everywhere. These are all player characters. And I loved it. I absolutely loved it. It was amazing. But it was a genre shift that had happened because the players had moved it that way. To my understanding, the people running the game had not intended for it to suddenly become a survival horror, but when the players made choices that led to that, they kind of went, okay, let's roll with it. Let's see what happens. And honestly, what happened was an amazingly good LARP.
That's so cool, and we'll definitely come back to talking about player empowerment and agency. But moving on from your background as the audience participants, what's your background as a creator? And I'm just going to go straight back to you, Finn.
Cool. So in terms of creating interactive fiction, I made the incredibly sensible decision to become part of the ref team for a bi-weekly LARP at my local university. And by bi-weekly, I mean we were running the interactive sit around and talk to each other as your characters stuff on Wednesday nights, and the run around and hit things as your character stuff on Sunday, and then you do it all over again the next week, which is, I don't know how many universities actually carry on doing that one as a schedule because it's punishing as heck, but that means creating a world and the mechanics of that for people to inhabit twice a week, every week during term time. For us, it was 2 years. For some teams, it's been up to 5, which was a lot. It was amazing, but it was a lot.
Yeah, I can imagine that. John, what about yourself?
Yeah, so I actually ran a Dungeons and Dragons setting for years that started in the Bronze Age and got increasingly bizarre as time went on. Would move forward a couple of hundred years every campaign or so, and so it ended up with some of the most strange things, like a devil worshipping, anti-slavery Bronze Age civilization, which seemed kind of contradictory, but it all came together just because the players just made strange decisions that I couldn't plan on having set the setting in motion. Um, but then on a more professional side, as I said, I worked in theater, and at one stage we had a pretty solid group of actors, and again, shocking reality television. A lot of the situations are completely contrived, and there was a reality television show in Ireland actually called Fáilte Towers. And yeah, it's this terrible name. But they wanted to have a wedding on the show, right? But obviously, who in God's name wants to have their wedding on a TV show in a country as small as Ireland? Like, that's all anyone will ever think about for the rest of your life. So they ended up contracting us to put together a thing. We wrote out the characters. We had everyone kind of figure out how they're going to work together. We ran through. And then they decided that on the day that they were going to be filming it, they wouldn't actually have us as the directors of the thing be on set. And so the whole thing went completely off the rails within about an hour and a half. And very steadily, they started realizing that the whole thing was a situation that was made up. Like the celebrities realized that it was a made up situation. And they actually took great offense at it. And I kind of find that a really interesting kind of a thing, because it speaks to how much you need people to actually choose to buy in to interactive fiction, because otherwise people feel like they have been tricked. And in this case, they were being tricked, and I wouldn't do it unless I was in need of money in 21. But it also speaks to the thing of that these things, as Finn was bringing up, you do need often some level of moderation, or these things can go completely off the rails without a referee or someone to like catch things. And especially in a situation where it's a wedding in Ireland, so everyone was drinking. So like a bunch of drunk actors are not exactly the easiest group of people to keep on, story. So that was probably the most interesting experience I had. And since then, I've done other interactive fiction with actors, but less so as time has gone on as a creator. I'd stop there because otherwise I'll just ramble about other creative things.
I'm just going to explain the Fáilte Towers and my complete wince to anyone from our international audience. It's a play on both the British sitcom Fawlty Towers and Fáilte, meaning welcome in Irish, and the tourist board being called Bord Fáilte, that kind of thing. So yeah, that was why I absolutely have had a full body cringe at that. Tess, talk about your background, which is quite extensive from the sounds of it.
Yeah, I'm trying to decide which thing I want to. I think so. Yeah, my wife and I actually, when we were graduate students, we created this thing together. So first of all, my wife and I, like, our relationship is built on creative collaboration. This has been at the core of who we are. We met in 1998. We've been collaborating together for a very long time, and one of the most successful things that we created that it was really just fun to watch people experience was the story called Dispatches from Algiers. And it existed in this space that was a hybrid between the physical and the digital world, where we created, some might even be over in a box somewhere, a glove with an RFID reader in the palm and a little radio on the back that you would wear. And then we had a series of evocative objects, some of which are lined up on the window behind me. And they had RFID tags on them. And you would pick up the objects, and the glove and the reader in your hand would read the tag, and it would trigger a piece of narration on a nearby computer that would play back a piece of a story from that object's perspective. And you also had a tabletop computer. This was 2008, I want to say, 2009, which had pictures of the objects on it and a map of the city. And different objects would grow or shrink in size to recommend different paths through it. And my wife, who at the time was doing AI recommender systems, had written algorithms that helped guide readers through this collection of objects who were telling you their story. But the thing that made it really interesting is that these were boundary objects, which is to say they existed as sort of interfaces between the physical world that our participants and readers were in and that imaginary fictional world that the character was in. And so when they picked up the top hat that the character wore, most of the people using it would put that top hat on. And when they picked up the goggles, they put the goggles on. When they picked up the goblet, they would mime drinking. And we didn't ask them to do this. The objects just afforded these embodied interactions. And so our participants, their bodies became sites for story meaning. They sort of stepped into the shoes of the player or of the character. And the story itself was this puzzle. And because the interaction was a puzzle and the narrative itself was this espionage thriller about a spy who is betrayed by his agency and goes on the lam and has to find his way to safety, there were all these really lovely parallels between what the reader was doing and what the story asked them to do. And what we saw was people, when we asked them about it later, they used first person when they talked about the story. When you asked them to retell the story, they wouldn't say, well, this was a story about a spy. They would say, well, I was a spy. And that shift from third person to first person was this really important thing for me, especially early in my career when I was trying to figure out how to create systems that would give people a chance to do that kind of skin jump into a new perspective or that perspective shift. So yeah, loved that one.
Is that the core of interactive narrative then? It's giving the audience to be the first person experience. You're not just passively watching, you're always going to have that first person experience.
It's, I think, for me at least, it is one of the pleasures that is most important. I think there are a lot of different pleasures that people have in play and in story, and they all overlap simultaneously. But for me, that's the one that I go to this for, because it's one I don't always get in other mediums. Although, like, when you read a book, like, well-written books put you into the perspective of their character. You get to live inside their head for a while, and that's, I think that pleasure is one of the profound pleasures of story writ large.
Mm-hmm. I mean, personally, I read a lot, but I also find, and yeah, you can get absorbed into a character, but I never feel quite the same level of connection as I do as when I'm playing. I think
there's something powerful about doing. Yeah, about being the vessel of action, right? About even if you're not choosing, if you're just like, following a script, you're doing, and that act of doing it yourself brings it inside you in a way that other media doesn't.
Mm-hmm. That kind of leads me on to my next question, which is just kind of around, what's your starting point when you are creating a narrative? Is it that you see an object and you think that would be really interesting, or you have a scenario that pops up, or you're inspired by settings, or you're writing for a particular audience? I mean, obviously, if you're doing things commercially, you're going to have certain, you're doing this because we've told you to do it. But is there a particular point of inspiration? I'm going to go to Tess first.
I mean, I'm neurodivergent. I'm autistic. I have ADHD. My brain is constantly like finding little like things it's interested in that it wants to hang stuff on, and I just squirrel them away. And so at any given moment, I have this like sort of just like collection of starts for things that, especially because I start a lot of projects that I never finish, of just like things kicking around in the background waiting to come forward. And sometimes it's just a spark that happens between two ideas. Sometimes it's something someone says to me. But usually they're hanging out in the background looking for the right project. And so like I have like one right now that I want to come back to is I had this story I started to write in 2003, more than 20 years ago, where the characters are actors in a theater and they're doing a performance of the Scottish play. And in this story, the conceit is that theater itself is a containment ritual, that it's a magical spell, and that it's used to keep the characters from getting off the stage, essentially. That when good theater happens, it actually evokes those characters into reality, so much so that if you don't have technical theater there to keep it safe, they get out. And in this, the characters from the Scottish play escape and start to cause mischief. And I started to write this story, and I was young and not really able to write it well, and so it's just sat in a folder. And now I'm starting to think about what I want my next thing to be, and I'm coming back to this because I'm like, ooh, I never did that idea as well as I wanted to, and now I could do it interactively. And so actually, I'm thinking of making a dollhouse or some other like physical object that this can play out on and do an augmented reality thing. I don't know. I'm playing around with ideas.
That's cool. Finn, I've forgotten what the question is now. No, what's your trigger point for writing things or creating things? What's
Yeah,
is one I missed when I was asking Tess as well. Is it ever the technology like you're like, oh, I want to play with this new tool or there's this new thing available I can try?
Yes.
So again, autistic, so brain sort of bouncing around, glowing onto things. But I think with LARP, quite a lot of it, at least from my experience, comes down to I want to provide a space where other people can experience an emotional experience that I've had at a game. So it's the idea of, okay, what emotions do I want the players to experience in my game? How do I want them to feel? And you can run some really effective horror by going, okay, I'm going to go for something that where the players will enjoy being scared. But also you can run, like we did with Weight of the World, which was the bi-weekly. We were aiming for community. We were aiming for, essentially, we want to write a setting where we've got two nations who've been at war for a whole chunk of time, who are now at peace. Our player party are a mixed group who are trying their best to hold that peace together. We wanted to sort of make a space where the player party felt like they wanted to stay together and like they wanted to protect that peace. So giving them a base, giving them places that they came from that felt like something good that you wanted to protect. And also, I will admit, that one partially, it was the first LARP back after COVID for our group. So a chunk of it was also, we want this fantasy world that you're going to be living in twice a week to be a place that you want to be. We're going to take out some of our darker ideas that we originally had. We're going to dial things back just a little bit because we've all just been through lockdown. We've all just been through all of that. Let's lighten things up just a wee bit.
Yeah. Moving on to John, I guess. Obviously, you've done things for commercial reasons, but what has given you? What's been your trigger point for doing when you've done them for pleasure or for fun?
So I'll stick with my Dungeons and Dragons experience for this. So as I said, I've been running this long setting for well over a decade now, very well over a decade. And one of the things that I tend to particularly enjoy about the interactive fiction is saying to the players that you can do whatever you want and actually letting them do whatever they want, but then also giving them the consequences. So I remember one very particularly, which was, it was a campaign. It went very well. Dragons had suddenly become a thing in the setting, and they were, bringing the eggs to various places for their own selfish reasons. And these players had been invested in this world before. This was the third or fourth campaign, and I they decided that they didn't want to be bothering with the obvious major threat that was building, and that the campaign was constantly going, by the way, there's a major thing that you should go back to that city to deal with. And they were like, nah, our characters are selfish, so we're not going to do that. And so they just took a shortcut, went through the fairy realm, did their thing, and went, well, that's us done. And it caused a horrific destruction that has lasted in the next 2, 3 campaigns since. And as players, they regret that they did that, but as the characters, they're like, well, no, that is legitimately what the characters would do. They would have no reason to have gone back to this dangerous situation. But as players, they're like, oh man, we really made a mess of this whole, we've been building this place for years and we kind of messed that one up, because they wanted to play selfish characters and they just let them have the space to do that. But the consequences need to hit, because otherwise they don't get the proper experience. Otherwise, it's just them going, I'm the best and so cool. So you need the consequences, I feel, to really make the setting and the experience feel real, because I think that happens an awful lot when I see people play role-playing games, be it tabletop or video, is that they don't really get invested until they do something and they go, wait, that guy can die? I didn't want that guy to die forever. I thought I could just like knock, they don't, the consequences make it real,
That is great. I'm going to come back to that almost immediately and just talk about kind of letting your players do things which are, will have consequences. But in terms of consequences, do you ever present consequences up front, or is it always going to be things they'll find out afterwards? I used to read Choose Your Own Adventure books by going through and keeping my finger in the place where I came from, just in case so I went somewhere I didn't want to be. Yeah, which was it's cheating, but I did it anyway because that was how I wanted to read it, and it's kind of spoilers, I guess. So in terms of consequences, do you ever forewarn the participants that this is a thing, this choice is going to lead to this other thing, or is it, how does that happen? John, I'll go to you first, since it's what we were talking about.
I mean, I just tend to lean on the old traditional, are you sure you want to do that? And once they say yes, then it's like, okay, well, we're going to see how that goes. I know how that's going to go, but I've given you a moment where you could back out of the situation.
There's a particular tone of voice that GMs use when they really, really were meaning. Really sure you want to do that? Finn, is that, do they get options from your LARPs?
So I think with LARP, because it's so immersive, because you are like, we sometimes talk about characters essentially borrowing your emotions. You're still feeling those emotions, you're just feeling them for a fictional cause. So quite a lot of LARP now, and at the very least things like University LARP, where you've got people coming in, this is their first time LARPing, they're possibly quite young. You'll have a thing where you might actually talk to someone out of character about an action that they're choosing to take. So, for example, we had a mechanic called Void, which was a type of negative energy that essentially got inside you and started to do horrible body horror things to you if you didn't get it treated. And so what we would do is, if we would essentially say, okay, you have to tell us that you're not getting it treated. If you don't tell us that you're not getting it treated, we assume you got it treated. If you tell us you're not getting it treated, we will then check in with you out of character and go, okay, this is the kind of themes that this is going to play with. Are you okay with that? And basically make sure we got a nice, clear out of character yes before we could then proceed with the horror. And we absolutely had newer players go, yes, I'm going to make this decision and I'm going to take the consequences. And then sometimes we had people go, okay, I thought I wanted those consequences, but actually I'm discovering that's not fun for me. Is there a way we can kind of sort of mitigate that a bit? It's like, yeah, there always is. Especially when it's like body horror, when it's stuff that could be triggering. When it's sort of more the party wants to make a decision that's going to cause a major problem, but it's less to do with stuff that might be out of character triggering, that's more a space for send an NPC in to go, right, you sure you want to do this? Here's the possible outcome from an in-world perspective that an NPC who you trust, think might happen. Sure you want to do this? Go for it. Okay.
I really like that mechanism of opt-in for things like that, because certainly when I played on the role-playing games back in the day, it was kind of like, okay, the ones I played on were consensual. You had to make sure if you were going to go somewhere that was deeply affecting somebody's character, then you needed to be checking in and making sure it was okay. But there are also other ones out there that were they were deliberately non-consensual, where you basically gave consent that stuff could happen to you and it would happen. And that's, yeah.
There's a fair number of horror LARPs that are sort of much darker that do the thing of, okay, up front, here's the warning list, here's the consent form, you know what you're getting into. This is the warning you're getting. Once you've signed up, you've signed up.
But it's still consent.
Exactly.
So, Tess, anything on consequences and whether you should have them know what you're getting yourself into?
So I've been thinking about this, and both John and Finn have said things that I'm like, ooh, I want to talk about that. Because I also I've done a fair amount of LARP, both writing and teaching and playing and performing. But the type of LARP I do typically doesn't have combat in it, because the people that introduced me to LARP came from the Nordic LARP tradition, and so like one of the things Finn talked about was they talked about emotions crossing players versus characters, and that the term that's used in Nordic LARP is bleed, and you can have both bleed in and bleed out, right? Where bleed in is when the personal feelings of your player inform how the character is going to act, and then bleed out is when the character is experiencing emotions that you then end up feeling as a player. And the counterpart to bleed is alibi, right? An alibi is how much distance there is between the identity of the player and the identity of the character. And high alibi LARP experiences or play experiences, the character can do a bunch of stuff that the player would never do themselves, and they have an alibi. Look, why I was doing this in character. Like John was talking about his players being selfish, even though they, as external to those characters, would not have been selfish. And then low alibi tends to also be very high bleed, where the connection between that player and the character is so close that you sometimes the line gets blurry. And in those situations, it can be really uncomfortable as a player when something happens to your character, because it also feels like it's happening to you, or when you have to do something in character that is distasteful or uncomfortable or triggering or traumatic for you. And so I think my answer to your question, to bring this all back around, is that the level of alibi really affects, for me, how much consent you need from a player, and how many safety precautions and guardrails you want around your experience for people to feel safe enough to actually do this thing that John talked about 2 questions back, was to give you that buy-in to actually like come with you on the experience you're trying to create. Because if you violate their sense of safety, if you violate their consent, if you throw a consequence at them that hits them when they're in a low alibi, high bleed situation and actually produces genuine real trauma, that's not okay, right? Like that is it. Like, you haven't just violated something inside the fiction, you violated something outside of it. And so I want to say that interactive storytelling, much like kink and BDSM, requires a lot of upfront negotiation and consent about where you put those guardrails and those boundaries.
Even something as simple as a haunted house, you are consenting to be scared when you go into that haunted house.
Yep.
And maybe if it's a really bad haunted house, you'll end up laughing instead, but it's, you are giving that consent.
I've actually worked in a haunted house, or, well, the dungeons, which is a similar experience. And despite the fact that we said up front, no, the actors will never touch you. That is literally a rule. We will never touch you. People still jump an absolute mile the moment that you move close to them. The slight problem is that we had rules about the actors not touching the public. We asked the public not to touch the actors, and they don't always follow that rule.
Yeah, it changes the experience. So we have been talking a lot about giving your audience the chance to do things, but how, as a creator, do you find a balance between letting them have that agency over the story, as opposed to you maintaining what your vision is. And I guess it's going to vary between different kinds of narrative, because and also how controlling you are, I suppose, is, and not necessarily controlling as in you want to be in charge of the story, but some GMs are definitely going to try steering everybody back on track because they've written the scenario and they want you to use it. Whereas others are going to be like, let's just see what happens. Yeah, I suppose there's a question in there somewhere, like, how do you find that balance? And I'm going to come to Tess last because I know that's something you particularly want to talk about. But so I'm going to just give Finn or John the chance to talk first, whichever one speaks up quickly, even if you have something to say on it. Okay, I'm going to call on John. Yep.
Yeah, I have an interesting thought that I actually just had before we started this about this, is that I feel when you talk about interactive fiction, you're often looking at almost different genres of interactivity. And so in terms of, let's say, Dungeons and Dragons role-playing games, there is a certain contract, I think, between the game master and the players all the time, where it's, if you make a character whose main objective in life is to settle down and like run a bakery and not get into trouble, we're going to have very difficult times going on adventures. So there has to be a certain amount of buying into that shared narrative. But I think there's also then more commonly in video games, the Telltale franchise being a prime example, where the story is set, but the narrative does change. And I think people misunderstand that term a lot. And by the narrative changes, the plot elements will happen, but how they happen and how you feel about them will change. So I'd often play them with my partner, and you'd run into the thing where, man, I really like that character, and I'd be going, I wish that character would die quite painfully, and they did because I made those choices. But I think then you also have another genre, which is kind of the emergent interactive fiction. And an example of that is, I think, Twitch Plays Pokemon that I studied, which is people were interacting and playing a game of Pokemon, like thousands of people playing one game. And because of that interaction, they made up fiction that was completely not intended by the creator, had zero control over it, and was purely the fans and participants creating their own fiction. And so I think generally it's a sliding scale that highly depends on what genre you're working in. Is it a game? Is it a narrative? Or is it like, oh, I didn't actually mean to create that?
Finn, do you want to add on anything around this?
So I think, like, absolutely in agreement with you, John, in terms of that sort of contract between game runners and players, because very much with LARP, there is this thing, especially with smaller games where you've got fewer game runners, of going, for example, so I need to go and make a potion. It looks like the stars aren't quite right for that. It might take me a bit longer than usual. I.e., I've noticed that the two refs are off over there doing something very busy. We're not going to bother them. Like, it's the thing of players going, the world has to work a certain way because of the fact that we're all playing a game. We buy into that. The other side of that is the refs don't then must mess with that either. Yeah. Like, if, for example, there is a thing of all missions out of this camp will go like X, you don't then make them go like Y without that having been at least hinted. If you've hinted very heavily, this is a non-combat encounter, it doesn't suddenly become a combat encounter unless that's part of the contract for the game. And sort of the amount of control you have over things kind of feeds into that contract, because it's about, okay, we let you go off the rails a certain amount. In return, you don't go off the rails more than that amount. Please. Like, especially with things like University LARP, where it's low budget, being completely run by volunteers who are usually quite stressed and were also working day jobs. It's like, we all agree this is a stressful enough situation, but we're all just gonna be chill with this.
So some of it's around managing expectations
Yeah.
of both sides of,
Very
okay,
much.
so if we give you this is what's going to happen. So Tess, how do you balance
Oy.
creator desire versus audience desire?
I have this like bullet point list that like is essentially the Cliff Notes version of my dissertation here that's emerged from just listening to John and Finn talk about this, because there's like so much here I want to talk about, but I'm gonna try to keep it under control and talk about a few things, which is that first of all, I think it's absolutely correct what both of them have said, that there's the social contract, especially when you're dealing with people face to face. And I think that we have to sort of make some genre distinctions between interactive stories that are happening socially between humans and interactive stories where portions of it have been encoded ahead of time in the form of a game, or like a choose your own adventure book, or something where you don't have a human storyteller there to engage in that sort of very delicate social dance of, is this appropriate? Do they know what they need to know? Am I taking care of them? Have they bought into this? All of those sort of questions that swirl around when you're in a LARP situation or a tabletop situation. My dissertation was looking at story games and digital stories, and also at participatory dinner theater and at interactive theater. And my work was looking at what actors do and how actors are trained when they do interactive theater to take an audience member and sort of pluck them out and put them up on stage, and with virtually no preparation and no opportunity to like sit down with them and do those negotiations, establish rapport, establish a sense of safety and trust, get buy-in, and then help that person feel good about what they're doing. Because I think the universal that cuts across all of these genres is that regardless of what your goals are as a storyteller with your plot and your characters and your narrative, your goals as a person who's giving somebody else an experience are always to give that person a sense of power and pleasure and enjoyment in their actions. And I say actions and not choices, right? Because actually, some of the most pleasurable and powerful actions that people can take in these experiences aren't ones where they're choosing between path A and path B, like you wouldn't choose your own adventure. They're about whether or not they feel like they're a part of a bigger thing, a part of a bigger story, whether they're in that moment. And so there's a technique. And the technique that actors use in interactive storytelling, the term actually comes from, or interactive dinner theater, it comes from dance and from partner dance. It's called backleading. And backleading is a series of strategies that you use as a performer or a storyteller when you have an interactor who hasn't had time to rehearse, hasn't had time to prepare, where you help them feel safe and comfortable and then provide them with those breadcrumbs that are going to guide them to get to do the cool thing that's going to feel good to do. And when they get to do it, everybody in the audience is going to applaud them. And like, that's that peak experience that I hope to give people when I create anything, is that sense of having sort of transformed themselves into the character, entered into the story so beautifully that actually what they would choose as a player gets set aside, and instead they're just immediate and they're present and they're acting and they're moving. And this is how I reconcile this tension between, player choice and player agency and authorial control, because I think that ultimately what I want as a player, and maybe this is just me as an autistic person who really likes to be shown like what to do in any given situation and wants to really know how to perform well and that I'm doing right, and wants to know the rules and wants to know the script. I like to give people scripts, and I like to, because I know that there is a pleasure in performing them, and that's the shortest version of the dissertation ideas that I think I can give.
That's actually reminded me, I went recently to a local production of the complete works of Shakespeare Abridged, which for those who don't know it is basically the complete works of Shakespeare Abridged in about an hour and a half. And I did not expect it to be as interactive as it was. And there were a lot of people there who at the start, who obviously did not expect that either. We were kind of having that, that kind of, oh no, they're going to expect me to get involved and I don't want to get involved. And by the end, everyone was fully involved and engaged. And I mean, that was obviously partly the script, but also largely the skill of the actors in bringing us in and making you feel complicit in what was going on. I think, because it's not just you're actually an accomplice to what they're doing on the stage, or well, the little bit of floor in front of me in this case. I think what you were talking about is really interesting for me. I've done, when I was working on playing on the big role-playing games, we'd very often script up kind of, these are the things that are going to happen over this next thing. But we'd bring the characters in and let them loose, but we'd still have stage gates, as if you were, that they have to get through to get to the next point of what's going on. And I find, in terms of narrative, that's interesting because it gives people lots of room within that. We actually kind of did a version of The Bachelor, which was hilarious. But we had these points, these things will happen, and we'll lose somebody, and so I like kind of having that blend of, you can roam free, but there is actually a structure to follow, and you kind of know where you're going. I found that in tabletop as well.
Can I actually add something to that?
Yeah, of course.
I think there is this myth of perfect choice and perfect agency that pervades conversations around interactive storytelling, where this is idea that, like, you really want to give players the freedom to do whatever occurs to them. But when you think about that, when you really unpack what that means, it's existentially terrifying to have perfect choice. It's existentially overwhelming to be faced with a blank page. And ultimately, as writers, our job is usually to cut through that blank page, right? Like, anybody can have perfect agency and perfect choice. They just need to sit down with a pen and paper, and they get to do whatever they want with the story. And the story can go whatever direction they want it to, and that's what writing is. And so when you come into a participatory narrative experience, people need the structure, they need that framework, because those frameworks are what they're going to play inside of. I like to think of it as a river, where you're kind of creating the banks and you're putting rocks in it, and you're sort of maybe in control of how fast it flows, and then the player is choosing how they navigate down it. And they're not ever going to, like, suddenly be on the moon. They're always going to be in that river, but the experience of it is something that you are creating together with them.
Oh yeah, John, go ahead.
So I actually just want to build on that point, because one of the things, the bits thoughts of creativity that I landed on, is that it's obstacles that allow creativity to happen, right? But you need to know how to solve those obstacles. And I happened to be listening to a podcast that was discussing escape rooms, as was brought up at the start of this, and they had a bunch of very elderly women come in as a group to play an escape room. But they, of course, had none of the basic, game logic that we all are familiar with, of, like, here's your inventory, this, that, all these things that we take for granted. And so the performers, like, as they said, they just accepted that we need to just change the rules so they know what they can do, or they're just going to exactly hit that sort of choice paralysis of, if they can do anything, they don't know what things they can do. It's too many options to actually figure out what do you use to navigate the obstacle,
That kind of leads into a question, which was, how, when things do go off the rails or don't go as planned, how do you, as somebody running an interactive narrative, and we're mostly, we're kind of outside the books and video games here, how do you bring it back on track when people John, do you want to answer that one at all?
I
just give up.
I have an odd one, which I'm going to say is an unintentional piece of interactive theater. I was doing a Terry Pratchett play years ago, and I got roped in increasingly into doing more roles. And there was one bit where an actor forgot their line. And this is a thing that will happen to everyone when they're doing anything, or you'll have it with even Dungeons and Dragons or LARPing, where, like, you're going, I know I meant to say something, but I actually have no thoughts in my head. And so what happened was, basically, was supposed to happen was, what they say about dwarves, and there was supposed to be a joke, but they forgot the joke. And so for 15 minutes, the 7 actors just kept going round in a circle around the table, having to just, like, keep going until the correct actor remembered what line got them out of this trap. And it was amazing. Like, it was impressive how they managed to keep doing that. But it's one of those things that I think it's very important to kind of make sure, if you're taking charge of these things, that you have methods to kind of flag people or guide people off, because otherwise you too easily get stuck in these things where you know, the classic Dungeons Dragons one is, well, how do we open this door? And you have half an hour of conversation and no one tries to open like actually try the door handle, you know? And sometimes I think you do need someone to just sort of like off stage shout the line or like go, just try the handle, guys.
Your rogue spending 10, like 20 dice rolls trying to lock pick when they could have just tried the handle and opened it. Yep. Yep, been there. Tess, how do you get people back on track?
It's so I've been struggling with, well, not struggling with this. I've encountered this recently. I've been doing one of these duet style surprise RPGs with another one of my partners, and this happened where I had, you know, she had created this character and given me, you know, it was a high school student, and she had these crushes, and she had this friend group, and she had a sister, and she had this town, and I had brought in a disruptive element that was supposed to be her call to adventure that would then take her on the road. And I had planned this whole story of this character on the run, trying to sort of survive the forces that are chasing her, and sort of had this call to adventure. And we did our first session, and we spent a lot of time in that town. We spent a lot of time with those characters, and we both got attached to them. And silly me, I thought, well, once we give her the call to adventure, she's going to have to leave all this behind. And when we got to that moment, she was like, no, I don't want to go with you. I want to stay here. There's a girl I like, and she seems to like me. I don't want to leave that. And so she had, like, through the course of producing the emotional bonds to the NPCs that we had created, I had trapped myself as a storyteller because we created a situation where she just didn't want to leave. Mm-hmm. And thankfully, I had time between sessions to sit down with that and think, okay, well, I gotta throw my story away now. I gotta do something different. And then I thought, no, I don't. Like, all of the same things can happen. They're just gonna happen here. And she isn't going to go to them. They're just going to come to her. And so I haven't really changed much of my story, although we did kind of hair off on a little tangent where she and her friends rescued another queer friend from conversion therapy and got in a fight with some nuns, which I didn't anticipate, but was brilliant and wonderful. And so now I'm just bringing it all home. And this is the way that I solved it as a researcher, and the way that I find myself now solving it as a creator is to think about the plot points and the character actions as being these things that are decoupled from the flavor and the emotion and the presentation and the detail of the story. And so, like, you can have, like, I did an interactive storybook back in grad school where we had a series of little skeletal characters on an adventure to rescue orphans. And as a player, all you could do was change the soundtrack and the color scheme. And so you had these characters who were doing the same things, and you were just changing the environment around them. And in doing so, the things that they said became either literal or ironic. They became funny or dark, because you were controlling the aesthetic. You were controlling the emotional vibe. I think vibe control is perhaps the best way to describe this phenomenon, where your players are going to be giving you a vibe, and you can fit your plot elements into whatever vibe they give you. How about that?
That's great. And we've got 2 minutes left. So I'm going to let Finn answer this quickly about how you get things back on track. And then I don't even know if I'm going to have time for another question. So, Finn.
Frantic improv.
Okay, that was succinct and, yeah, actually really valuable. You're right. Sometimes that's what it takes. You can have another minute to elaborate if you want.
I mean, the one I remember for this one is a short game we ran where all the characters were ghosts in the British Museum. We gave them away to speak to the Egyptian gods. We did not make it one use only. They decided to try and essentially go through the phone book, which resulted in a lot of running around and switching masks, and then me finally showing up as Anubis to essentially point out that I was very busy, as was everyone else, and knock it off. Which, to be fair, they did then do.
Right, we are absolutely out of time, and I'm going to get shouted at, and we're going to get cut off. So there was so much more. I mean, I had a load more, so many more questions, and there's an awful lot more we could talk about. We do have a Discord channel if anyone does want to ask questions, is watching this later, or has things. I was actually going to get you to all ask each other a question, and there was no time for that. So Discord's a good place for it. I'm going to wrap up. Very sadly, because I've really enjoyed this. This has been our panel on interactive narratives, which I find hard to say. Thank you so much to Tess and Finn and John, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of Opticon. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.